Hey there, John.
Howdy, Ryan.
All right. We've been very excited to talk about this one. So this is an article called "Leverage Points: Places to Intervene in a System," and it's by Donella Meadows. Um,
Who
and
has been actually deceased now for quite some time.
yeah, we were just
And
discussing beforehand, and we're kind of surprised at how early in time this was written, back in the
yeah,
late '90s.
yeah, especially considering all the events that have happened the last few decades that feel like could very easily fit into this article pretty well. Or like a lot of predictions were made that seem to have been borne out by recent history. So,
Right, yeah,
um,
it seems very prescient and seems like in many ways it's discussing events that have happened since.
right.
Yeah.
Clearly, an excellent piece of scholarship that has stood the test of time here, even in the short run of the last couple decades since she wrote this. So, um,
Yeah, yeah. So she, I guess, originally had the idea for this article, when what was it, NAFTA, that she was like kind of in the room as they were designing the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act, and
yeah, and GATT, which I did not know what that was, and the World Trade Organization.
mhm.
So it was like all three of those. I don't know what GATT is.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. So a lot of like major structures in the global economy. What's GATT, John?
General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Okay,
Okay,
it came into a bit came into an existence in '95. Oh wait, pivotal post-war agreement established in 1947. Um,
hmm.
and it evolved into the World Trade Organization in 1995. So I guess
Gotcha. Okay, yeah,
this was sort of the GATT was the old school, and then it had been brought up into obviously NAFTA was mid 90s. All this stuff was like then mid 90s. Okay.
yeah, interesting. And yeah, so I guess she was in the room where it happens in terms of creating the World Trade Organization, and some of the structure around that system. And so as they were discussing how to create this new world trade system, she, I guess, was one of the voices that was talking about how systems work, right? And she she had some choice words, I think, for how how the others in the room were discussing it. And frankly, I don't know, based on what I know about the World Trade Organization, if her ideas really won out terribly well.
Yeah.
But it led her to write this treatise on the different leverage points, places that you can intervene in a system.
Yeah. And a system in this particular case can basically be perhaps something like an economy, but it could also be like an environmental system. Like she gives talks a lot about like fisheries and fish stocks and stuff like that. So basically, really any kind of system that you can think of, both natural and like man made.
Yeah, yeah, and like at its simplest, probably you could define a system as just any organization of multiple components that interact with one another, right? So you can have
Yeah,
very simple systems,
like the bathtub, which she
right, which we'll use it
uses
as
for a
as an
lot of her
analogy in a second,
analogies.
and then you can have obviously the global economy, which is far more complicated. Yeah,
And
so
this our first video here is going to be more of an introduction to the piece as a whole, and then we will kind of go point by point through the article and discuss kind of each of these different leverage points in turn, as there's quite a few interesting things really to be like said and discussed. Questions, quite frankly, it's very complex, and if you're not a systems engineer, which I'm not, and Ryan obviously has dabbled far more in the sciences and math and things like that than most of us, but you wouldn't obviously call yourself a systems engineer either. So this is this is definitely some stuff that I think probably for us regular folk is not intuitive, and she actually says that repeatedly that a lot of the trouble with designing systems of any kind is that people often get it wrong because they don't What what appears intuitive is apparently not how this stuff like actually ends up really working. So,
Not necessarily intuitive, yeah.
yeah,
And even her, so like when the story that she tells, right, is at the World Trade Organization meeting, she kind of was getting a little fed up with the discussions around where the other individuals in the meeting were trying to intervene within like the global economy. And so she went up onto the whiteboard and she jotted down 9 different points, leverage points within a system. And even she ended up like amending that to be 12.
yeah.
So this article is 12 different points that we'll go through in some separate videos. But yeah, so I guess even for her, which her stock and trade is systems thinking, right? She immediately have like laid out in her mind, like, well, what are all these points you can intervene in a system, and what is their hierarchy when she started thinking about this. So she's got a couple of models to help us understand what a system is. The first one is a diagram, and then she has an analogy on top of that diagram. So the diagram is in the article, and it's very simple. All it does is it has an arrow that says inflows, and then state of the system, a little box into which the inflows arrow goes, and that's kind of like what is in the system at present, and then an arrow going out of the box that says outflows. So basically you put things into the system, then there's stuff in the system, and then there's stuff coming out of the system.
Coming out
right?
of the system.
And then out of those are kind of like the main components, like the physical components of the system. But then she has a little arrow coming out of the state of the system that says the perceived state of the system. So that's kind of like, whoever is managing the system, what they think is happening with the conditions in the system. And then that leads into another component that says discrepancy, right? And that discrepancy has arrows going back into the inflow and the outflow arrows, which if there's a discrepancy in what's going on with the system, then the way to change the material state of the system is to adjust either the inflows or adjust the outflows, right? And then finally, outside of all that, she has one more arrow that goes to discrepancy that is called goal. And that's basically whoever's managing the system, whatever the goal or intent for the system is, that's going to influence what they do when they see a discrepancy in the system. How are they going to change the inflows or the outflows in order to achieve the particular outcome they want based on that perceived state of the system? So,
do you think that the perceived state here could also maybe not be just on the order of like the people that are managing the system, but also on like say like the people living in a certain nation state, like how they view what's going on in like, because sometimes, I mean, I think we've even seen this in recent times that the actual state of affairs versus the perceived state of affairs can be quite different. An example that comes to mind. There
could be discrepancy between the reality and the perception of that reality, right?
Exactly, because what I'm thinking here in terms a little bit of like, just to point something out, obviously we all know with COVID there was, massive economic downturn kind of across the world. But if you look at everybody compared to everybody else, the U.S. under Biden did pretty well on most metrics, again, relative to the rest of the world, even though we had not returned to where we were prior to the pandemic.
Right.
But the perception, obviously, right, and I think this played a huge part in the last election as well, was that he, that the economy was bad, that things, he wasn't doing things well, and there was like that lack of understanding of the information between the fact that like, how we had done relative to everybody else, which is kind of what you would really have to like judge it by at that point.
Yep.
But that was not being done. So I'm wondering too if this perception can sometimes maybe even be perhaps not even on the order of like the makers and changers, but could be on the other people participating in the system. What do you think?
Well, so my read on that is that you can kind of take two perspectives. One is that, I guess my overall read is that you when thinking in terms of systems should be flexible when considering like who the managers are, right? So in a democracy, the people are electing representatives, right? So that perceived state of the economy influenced who was chosen to be the
Right.
in the person
The
in control,
manager.
the manager of the system, right? So
Right.
in a sense, the people are managing who controls the system that then like exerts more like holistic control on the system from the executive branch level. So there's kind of like multiple levels there, right? And you can also think about like the perception of the people as a condition within the system. So if you're at the level of the president and you want to continue to be president, you need to
Right.
manage that state of the system
Right.
so that you change their perceptions, so that you can continue
You get
to be in
reelected.
power, right? Yeah.
Right,
So there's
right.
kind of like there's like a meta perception, right? Which is like what are the people that are controlling the system, but then also like perceptions of like the individual components of the system, which if you want to kind of zoom out and view the people within a democracy as components rather than those that are directly in control, then their perception is part
Matters
of
as
the
well.
conditions of the system itself.
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I
that's
just
like
wanted
that's
to-
an interesting question though, right? And
Yeah.
again, like I don't think there's I don't know if you have any other ideas beyond that, but yeah, I think systems that are sufficiently complex, who's controlling them and by what method can be kind of murky, and you can probably look at it in different ways, and multiple ways can be correct, right? So again, like the people are exerting some amount of control, probably not no individual person in the democracy is exerting as much control as the president, the individual who is the president, right? So you kind of have those like layers of management, right? And you can sometimes view like the people at the bottom level, the individuals, as more of like components of the system rather than being in control. But in another
Right.
sense, they also are in control, right? So there's those feedback
Yeah.
loops that kind of like everything kind of plays into everything else. And as she moves on with other points, right, some components of the system, like the paradigm or the goal of the system, those are like things that even the managers of the system are kind of operating underneath, right? So,
Right.
and individuals have the capacity to change those too. So you can kind of
Right.
step outside the system, make some changes, but then be back within the system. So you can kind of be like within and without of the system.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
And part of me wonders too. It seems like with something like this that there's a chance that maybe nobody really. Well, I should probably not a chance. Probably the likelihood is that nobody like truly understands. Like nobody's perception is gonna be flawless of like these like giants like the managers
Right.
as well
Yep.
as like the managed are all probably going to have some perception of things that might not actually match up with the reality. At one point, this is just slightly jumping ahead, but she brings up more like autocratic systems with like the Soviet like central planning kind of idea, and sort of this idea that if you don't have all of the information, you can't really manage these like vast systems always very well.
Right. Yeah.
And basically if nobody actually has all of the information, then like in some form or fashion the perception of like reality is always going to be distorted because there's just going to be information that isn't available to everybody at all times. And so this part of me almost wonders if this is like one of those cases where maybe like historians, like 100 years after the fact or something, can get a better sense of like what really happened. But there's
Right.
this sense that like when we're living in these systems and things in like real time, just like with wars, like afterwards, the historian can go and be like, well, the general on this side was doing this, and but obviously in real time, the general on one side doesn't know what the general on the other side is doing, so they're like operating from like imperfect information under the fog of war, and they're making like their best, basically guesses and strategies and whatnot, but they don't have all of that information, and so it's kind of like you could have been a active participant in events and not really have any clue what was going on in the events that you like lived through, even
Right, just a cog in a
in like a
machine,
real
a
way.
cog in a system. Yeah,
Yeah,
and even the historian, right, is still going to be missing information. We'll never have a complete or exhaustive set of
right.
information for any event.
Yeah,
And she eventually does kind of talk about it towards the end, which yeah, I'll be interested for our discussion on that. But yeah, and she eventually talks about kind of like she capitalizes not knowing, right? Which is, no system is going to have complete information. So you try to build systems that can work around that lack of information. And that's one of her major points, right? So,
yeah.
yeah. All right, so let's quickly go through her analogy, right? So
With the
she
bathtub?
gives just in terms of like the layman like us understanding what a system is. She uses an example of a bathtub, right? So the bathtub has an inflow and it has an outflow. The inflow are the faucets, right, that add water into the bathtub, and then the outflow is the drain that pulls water out of the bath, right? And then the state of the system, right, is the water that's in the tub. And you either can have more or less water. The water can be some temperature, can be hot or can be cold, and there's other factors you can take into account, right? So she basically walks us through that if you want to fill up a bath, you turn on the faucet and then some amount of inflow goes in, and you have a desired goal for your system, some amount of water that you put in, and then once it's there, you turn the inflow off, right? Then you have that amount of water in the tub. But then if you step into it, you have some amount of volume. If you overestimated how much water should be in there, then it starts spilling out, and then you need to activate that outflow, right? Pull out the drain and then
plug,
get some water out of there. So that's kind of her very simplistic example of a system, right? So it's got the inflows, got the outflows, and then because we have the goal of having just enough water so we can be in there, be covered with the water, and not have any spill out, we have a goal and we can manage those inflows and outflows based on that goal, right? And then on top of that, she layers on, well, what's the next level, right? What about if you want the correct temperature of the water, right? So then you're dealing with two different faucets, one hot, one cold, right? And if you turn the hot one on, it has to pull hot water from somewhere. And let's say that the water boiler is 4 floors down, so it takes some amount of water, some amount of time for the hot water to make it to you. And then that's a feedback or an information loop that is like distant in time from once you see the hot water appear. So now if you're trying to control the temperature, you don't know until you feel the water if it's too hot, and then you try to turn on some cold water, then some hot water. So there's all these different controls that you're making while you're adjusting those two variables, the temperature of the water or the volume of the water. Of the water. And then obviously it goes on from there. If we expand out to a bigger and bigger system, there's going to be plenty more variables.
Well, and even just on the order of the bathtub, she obviously points out that there are some factors that also impact the system that likely were not designed by the person that's doing the bath. For instance, how fast the water flow, comes out of your faucet, right? If you were filling up a bathtub with like a fire hose, for instance, it would take much less time than for the water coming out of the faucets. Also, if you get like blocks in the drains,
and you're much more likely to overfill it, right? Because it's
it
so fast that you have to be quicker to cut it off than to than
and
just
then
regular faucets.
And then even things like the drains, if the drains are plugged up or whatever, can also impact. So there's like blocks that might not even be by your tub, but are just somewhere further down in the chain of your pipes.
Right, exactly.
Yes,
you can start.
So you
thinking
see how this
about
stuff gets complex.
Yeah, it gets very complex very quickly, right?
Very quickly.
And obviously, when we start thinking about the most interesting systems, right, like economies or global trade, culture, all that sort of stuff,
environment.
If there's so many variables that it is useful to have some leverage points to consider as you're making changes to those systems, and to have a general idea of how systems work. So towards that point, she came up with originally in that World Trade Organization meeting 9 points, and then she refined this to be 12 points. So we'll quickly just name them, and then we'll jump into
one last thing before we do that that I would say was probably like just a big takeaway from this whole thing, and that she definitely hits in the intro is that just how complicated systems are, especially huge ones, and that we often don't have a very good understanding of how they behave, and that honestly, sometimes trying to do something intervening can almost create more problems than just maybe letting like the system go as it is. And that
Right.
basically, we should never think that these things are simple. That anytime we read about these
Right.
like complex events in the around the world, that uh, that we need to always remember just how complicated they are. We can't just be flippant and be like, oh well, we could fix that in like an afternoon. That's like no, like why is this well? Because actually, a lot of these things are
Right.
so interwoven and complicated to a degree that most of us don't really have any real understanding of. So that
Yeah,
might
and
just be a good
probably
takeaway for
yeah,
general reading.
absolutely. And probably part of the reason why, and she goes through great pains to mention how counterintuitive a lot of this is to, our usual way of thinking. And probably part of the issue is that, our minds are kind of trained and have evolved to be systems that generate relatively simplistic models, right? So that when we see a tiger, we know to run away from it. We don't need to get to know the tiger to know if this one's aggressive rather than friendly, right? You just run.
Yeah.
So when we think about these complex systems, our intuition is not built very well for this because we're trained and the human mind is constructed in a fashion that tries to make simplistic models. And so when we have something that's so complex, it's counterintuitive for us to look at. But obviously, if we know something about systems and kind of the hierarchy of different ways to change systems, perhaps we can do so with more intentionality and with better efficacy, right? So the leverage points that she came up with, there are 12 of them, and she kind of goes through them in this article. So I'll quickly read them, and then we'll have a
Starting
few videos
with
looking at this.
basically the ones that she thinks are the least effective
Yeah,
leverage
yeah. So
points,
they
and she
start
works to what she thinks is the most uh, effective,
exactly,
basically.
yeah, in order of effectiveness. And I'm sure that we will, when we discuss, maybe have some quibbles with that sort of stuff. So, yeah, so at number 12, at the bottom, the least effective, or the top of the list where she starts, is constants, parameters, and numbers. I'll just read them quick, and then we'll discuss the actual
Yep.
intricacies
Yep.
of them when we get there, right? Then number 11 is the size of buffers or other stabilizing stocks. Number 10 is the structure of material stocks and flows, the things coming into and out of the system. Number 9 is the length of delays relative to the rate of system change. Number 8 is the strength of negative feedback loops. Number 7 is the gain around driving positive feedback loops. Number 6 is the structure of information flows. Number 5 is the rules of the system. Number 4 is the power to add, change, evolve, or self-organize the system itself. 3 is the goals of the system. Number 2 is the mindset or the paradigm out of which the system arises. And number 1 is the power to transcend paradigms. So obviously some of those are a little more straightforward than others. And yeah, it'll be interesting to discuss them. So cool. All right, so we'll end this here, and then we'll go through our points in each video.
Point
Does that sound good?
point by point. Yep.
Cool.